And we are back with another episode of Cherie and Elizabeth Talk Sports. I am Elizabeth Emery from Hear Her Sports Podcast, and I am with Cherie Turner, my good friend from Strides Forward Podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing really well, Elizabeth, and I'm going to start us off by staying super, super positive. We had a really positive video last week, and I was reviewing it, and I just thought, that's really exciting, and there's so much to be excited about in women's sports. And I know it's really easy to get down on things that aren't going well, and the lack of coverage, and the way things are covered are not exactly how we want them, but there's some things that are really good that are going on. And so I'm just going to stay on that track because I had the opportunity to have free reign of ESPN. I don't have ESPN at home yet, but I did over the last week. And I was watching the NCAA Softball World Series, they're calling it. And so obviously it's the women's game. And it was so exciting. It was so good. These players are great. They make great plays. They make this game super fun to watch. The coaches are so excited, men and women. The crowds were outstanding, and the coverage was really good. There were men commentating, there were women commentating, and it was just well done. And it just made me so happy because I think I've been so grouchy about ESPN because they're easy to beat up on. And just like, well, they don't give me what I want. And so I just find lots of reasons to criticize them. And it's been pointed out recently that ESPN is actually doing some really good work in diversity, and they are upping their women's coverage. And this was just exciting to see, and they're doing a good job. And I want to say good job where good job is due, right? So so I'm
Yeah.
super excited. And I've never turned on the television to watch women's softball, and now I did. And I'm gonna subscribe. Like, I'm really excited to see, this is gonna play out over the next little bit here. Like, we're well into the tournament, so the champion's gonna be decided pretty soon here. But yeah, I'm excited to watch some of these last games. And I was excited to watch the games leading into it. And so, yeah, I really want to give a big shout out to great coverage of women's sports. So
I
excited.
think that's yeah, it's totally awesome, and it sounds like ESPN is actually spending some money to do this coverage. Having more than one commentator, and it sounds like the camera work is good. I think it's great.
Yes.
It's
Yeah.
exciting. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
good on
And the
them.
commentators know their stuff. It's interesting to hear about the players. Like, I don't know anything about any of these women playing. And I am learning a lot. And it's really well done. It seems, and I would imagine that if you were someone who was deep in the sport, you would enjoy it just as much,
That's great.
So I don't feel like it's just playing to people like myself.
Right.
So, yeah. How about you, Elizabeth? How are things on your end?
Well, going really well. I don't know if I've told you that for a very long time, since pre-pandemic, I would say 9 months before pandemic, I've had a lot of hot flashes because of
Ugh.
menopause, and they are dreadful. And I've come to realize that I have more hot flashes than most people. It's lasted a really long time. I have many, 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 many during the day and at night, so I'm not sleeping. And I've been reading Dr. Stacey Sims' book that she wrote with Selene Yeager, and it's called Next Level. And I got to the part about adaptogens. And
Right.
adaptogens, and I will read it from the book. Stacey Sims writes that the adaptogens are plants that increase your body's resistance to stress. And Stacey Sims uses the word stress in a very specific way. She's not talking about, like stress from your job or your family. It's anything that puts wear and tear on your body. So if you're not eating well or sleeping well, that's all stress. And you can go to the episode that she was on and hear her sports, and she really describes it well, what actually she means. So I read this bit about the adaptogens, and she names 4 or 5 in the book, and I and she lays out what they're each for. I mean, they're all for pretty much the same thing, but I chose one that was very specifically highlighted for hot flashes. I bought it locally on Thursday, and it's a stimulant, so you're supposed to take it in the morning. So I took the first dose on Friday morning, and at dinner on Friday night, I realized I hadn't had any hot flashes because normally during
No.
dinner, yep, normally
It's
during dinner I'll
amazing.
hot flash. And I was like, wow, one day it sort of solved my problem. So I'm on day 3 now, I think, or 4. We're on Monday. you're supposed to test it for 2 weeks, so we'll see how long this lasts. I mean, will I acclimate it or something? I don't know. Anyway, right now it's great. I'm finally getting some sleep, uh, and I also feel sort of more clear-headed and positive, which may help with our new program of being positive. So it's really fantastic. And I also just think it's so crazy because, as I said, I've had hot flashes since pre pandemic. I've seen various people and talked to various people and read a lot of stuff, and not one of them mentioned these adaptogens. And I was looking both for pharmaceuticals and herbal, so I was open to anything.
Right.
I just think it's amazing that it took Stacey Sims' book to get there. It still blows my mind.
Yeah, yeah. And it does point to the critical need for this research
For
and
sure.
for it to be disseminated and for us to be able to talk about menopause and hormone shifting and all of those things that have seemed to be so, or they have been so taboo. And, they really turn people's lives upside down. Half of our population is going to experience this. And to be able to get like smooth out the bumps of this really chaotic hormonal time is really important. And, you and I have talked about too that these symptoms can kind of sneak up on you.
Yeah.
And, you don't know if they're going to hit, when they're going to hit, how severe they might be. And there seem to be some correlations with like health and fitness and getting through menopause a little bit easier, but sometimes those
But
things
not
don't
always.
happen.
Yeah,
Yeah,
but not always.
it's not a for sure situation because you are certainly somebody who is fit and healthy.
Right.
And we've seen this, in many different circumstances, lots of anecdotal and other evidence that
Right.
it's not a direct correlation. So that's so awesome, Elizabeth.
I think it's
Yeah,
great. And I also want to point out that, well, at least for me, I didn't really understand what hot flashes were. I had this sort of, I had heard about hot flashes, like your
right,
mother talks about it, but well, my mother sort of mentioned it, but didn't really talk about it and everything. But I really, dismissed them, or I didn't attribute sort of the disruption that you talked about to them because it does cause lack of sleep. It does cause being grumpy, which, impacts your relationship with other people, impacts your relationship with work. And I just think it has such a bigger consequence than what I heard when people said the word hot flash.
right. Yeah,
Yeah.
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 And I have not experienced them, so I cannot identify on that level, but
I
I might.
You might, and I hope you do not. I don't wish it on anyone.
Yeah.
Anyway, we are going to move on to our media section, and we are going to talk about what happened at the French Open. There is a new director there. Her name is Amelie Mauresmo, and she said some things. We're going to talk about what she said, but we're also going to talk about the tennis podcast. There were 2 episodes that dealt with what happened, and so we're going to talk about both of those. The tennis podcast is hosted by Catherine Whitaker. She is the Amazon Prime video TV commentator, and also David Law, the BBC Radio 5 commentator. And then they have Matt Roberts, who's also a commentator. He came on more recently and started doing their social media, but now is a favored host. Anyway, so what happened was Amelie Mauresmo was asked about why only one game out of the 10 featured night games was a women's game. And she basically said, and I really encourage everybody to go listen to the Day 11 podcast of the tennis podcast to hear what Catherine Whitaker says. And she reads out what Amelie Mauresmo said, because I'm not going to go into the details of that. I really want you to go listen to the tennis podcast. But essentially what she said was the women's game is not as appealing as the men's game. And that's why we are only having one night game. And to
Yeah.
you.
And yes. So my short reaction is this is awful. And I honestly feel like this woman should get fired for this for so many reasons. And I agree with you that people need to go listen to the reaction from Catherine Whitaker because it's emotional, it's true. She's just so completely devastatingly sad about the fact that somebody who runs a major tournament would say something like that. And also it's worth pointing out that this tournament director was also a professional
Yeah.
women's tennis player. She was one of the top in the world. And for her to come out and, and they talk about this in the podcast episode, the number 11, uh, for her to come out and say this just fuels the fire of all the people who are like, women's sports aren't interesting. Look,
Right.
this woman said so, and she's the director of a tournament, and she was one of them.
And
Like
she's a
it's
woman.
and she's a woman. Like it's just there's so many things about it that are so awful. Not the least of which is that it isn't true.
I was just going to say, it just does, the argument doesn't hold up.
No, no, not at all. And, when I did go ahead and listen to some other episodes of that podcast, I hadn't heard it before. And it's a great podcast. I'm not
Yeah.
a huge tennis fan. It made me excited about tennis. And they were talking in depth about how great the women's game is
Yeah.
and how they're excited to see these upcoming rivalries and on about just these exciting players coming up because maybe there is a bit of a sea change going on. I don't have the in-depth knowledge of
I don't
tennis
either.
to
Yeah.
talk about it well, but they had some very exciting things to say. They made me excited about the women's game. And to think that there was this decision made by someone who's so into this sport, so deeply entrenched in the sport, who decided that it should be a 90-10 split on the focus of the men's versus women is just, it's horribly offensive. Not to mention the message it sends horrible messages to the audience, but also the
Totally.
players.
Totally. Yeah, totally. But you know what? So I didn't understand why she was so obsessed with these rivalries. Because,
Oh, yeah.
I mean, for a long time, I have in the past followed tennis. I don't really that much now. I don't know. I mean, that's not why I watched it. I mean, I get the appeal, but it's not certainly not the only reason I watch it.
I have a feeling that that's a little inside baseball with those guys. Like that's a
Mm,
little something that I don't know is maybe the way they like to commentate on things. Or I got the sense that they just had fun with rivalries, and so they were
mhm.
excited to sort of perpetuate this idea. And
But
and
Amelie was talking about the rivalries also.
oh, okay,
Yeah.
oh, right, yeah. It is kind of funny how and I've heard talk about rivalries in other sports, and I feel the same way where I'm just sort of like I don't really care.
Yeah.
I just like watching good sports. We come back to this a lot, right? Where it's just like I just want to see good sports,
Yeah.
as evidenced by now I'm excited about softball, because it's exciting to watch people do things well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely. I
So
think I really think that not having more women's game does such a disservice, and they really do talk about that in the episode 11. Like to the sport. I mean, it could have lasting damage effects on the
yes.
sport for a long time. I will say in the next episode, the follow-up episode, Catherine Whitaker was able to speak with Amelie like a special setup conversation, and the host then talked about sort of you know talked about what the conversation was. And anyway, they seemed very positive about it. They gave Amelie Mauresmo, a lot of hope and wanted her to succeed. I am not feeling the same.
I have to agree with you. My feeling was I'm surprised that she didn't step down or be asked to step down. This just seemed like such a horrible misstep because it's not just about men versus women. This is revenue. This is
Right.
half their, or I don't know how it would be divided up, but this is a huge portion of tennis. It's their sport that they're trying to promote, and it's just oh, this side of it is boring.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and to do that to your own sport is just absolutely shocking to me. Especially again, I just come back to it just isn't true. Women's tennis is way too competitive for the players not to be excellent. Maybe it's not the best players that ever played and a whole bunch of them, but my gosh, you would just never see this in another sport either, right? It wouldn't be oh, there's not the greatest football being played right now, so we're just not going to show it.
Right. Right.
But yeah, I do agree. It was interesting the sort of understanding they gave Amelie after having some more thought about it and this extra conversation with her, that there was sort of all this hopefulness around it. And I just sort of thought I wouldn't want somebody representing my sport who did something like that. you
Right.
know. Yeah. Yeah. So maybe they're more hopeful for reasons I don't really understand, but
Yeah.
I
Maybe.
I didn't get it either. So I
Yeah,
thought that yeah. Go ahead.
and I would have. She never said, for example, Amelie. She never said, "You were right. I should have had 5 women's games and 5 men's games." She never said that.
Right.
She tried to explain what she meant in the original comments about men's games being more appealing,
Right.
and it didn't hold water for me the second time.
Well, exactly. She just goes on to more in depth explain that, it wasn't that women, because I think what she was getting at was it wasn't like, oh, all the time men's games are more interesting than women's games. It's at this moment,
Right.
the women are going through a slump. Like this generation or this, particular year of the women's game isn't as great as the men's. So we're going to highlight more of the men's game. And there was the follow up question, which of course is on everyone's mind, which was, well, if next year the men's game is going through a slump, are you going to have it 9-1 the other way around? And we all know the answer to that question
Right.
is 100% no.
Yeah.
Like no one would let that happen. That's the other thing is it's like, who, if she would have proposed, hey, I'm the woman director and I'm having 9 highlighted women's games and 1 men's game,
Very interesting.
they wouldn't have let that. There's no way that would
No.
fly.
No.
Like,
Yeah.
not even 8-2 or 7-3. I don't see any way that ever gets to be anything other than 5-5 in favor of the women.
Right.
So, yeah. Yeah, and I mean we can only postulate about that, but I just don't
I think
see
we
it.
can. Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
see it. So,
This very much feels to me like a topic I'm going to have to follow, because I do want to see what happens, to her, to Amelie Mauresmo, but also, the ongoing commentary. I'm sure the tennis podcast will continue to discuss it, or I would hope so. And also next year, what happens? I mean,
right.
there were a lot of changes that possibly could happen. None of them seemed, I don't know, they all seemed like a lot of excuses to me, actually. But it will
Right.
be interesting.
Yeah, and something you and I have talked about previously is that there's also something to be said for watching young players or newer players come up. And that's how you build excitement about the future. Like you can't always just focus on who's the hottest thing going right now. Like you want to build momentum, you want to get people excited about who's making big moves, and you don't give people the opportunity to see that if they only get to see one game that may or may not be a great game. Like that's a
Right.
lot of pressure to put on this one game, and you get to give the men 9 tries at it,
Right.
right? Of
I also
having
think that, like, sports is so interesting because it's not always successful. I mean, because of that arc that she's talking about, and the slumps and the not slumps, and the growth, and, learning, and that all is interesting, and people who like sports appreciate that. And so
right,
if you're not seeing like the greatest match of the century, that's not a disappointment.
right. Yeah. Yeah, to get to say like, "Oh, we got to see this highlighted game, of this young player like as she was on her way up and then a few years down the road this person's the greatest player in the world." Like, those sorts of matches are really important, and I think that that's just completely disregarded in this situation. And I will say it did sound like there were missteps in other ways. Like there were other little
Sure.
details about like one of the matches went till 1 in the morning. Nobody could get public transit home, so people were stuck, and there were no Ubers left. And Marisma was like, "Oh, I hadn't even considered that."
All
It's
I could
like,
think of was let them eat cake. That was totally the let them eat cake of public transport.
yeah, yeah, the whole thing. It was just sad to me.
It was sad. And I do
So
want to point out before we sign off that one of the games that was discussed in the episode 11 was a men's game, which the host pointed out was completely uninteresting because it was against one guy who everyone and their grandmother knew was going to beat the other guy. And I'm sorry, I don't follow tennis. I can't give you the names, but that's what she is calling more appealing than like any other women's game. So,
right.
and I just tell that story just to highlight that her argument didn't hold up.
Well, exactly, exactly. And I do want to end on a positive note, and I think that positive note is that people were very upset about this. as well they
Yes.
should have been. Like there is an appropriate reaction, and that is people thought that she made a very big mistake.
Yeah. And hopefully things will change and people are going to watch for
Yeah.
sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So,
All right.
yes.
That's it for this week. In our attempt to be positive, this is Elizabeth from Hear Her Sports, and I'm with Cherie Turner from Strides Forward podcast. And
Thanks
we'll
so
see you next
much.
week. Bye
Bye
bye.
bye.